Welcome back to DC Silver Age Storytime, and today's story is from Action 247. It was published in December 1958 with story by Otto Binder and art by Al Plastino. The Return of Superman's Lost Parents. Superman says, "It's Ma and Pa Kent, the couple who adopted me when I was super baby. But how, but how can they be here when they died years ago?" And Pa Kent says, "We know what you're thinking, son, but thanks to this time machine, we've come out of the past to visit you in the future." So one day Clark Kent is sitting there, and all of a sudden there's some mist and a bubble. Clark says, "Why, it's a plastic bubble that appeared out of nowhere with a man and woman inside. Who are they? Don't you recognize us, son?" So there is Martha and Jonathan Kent. "How can we be alive visiting you?" "Well, son, this time machine whisked us from the past into the future. So I guess they know that they're dead." So they at some point died. And I don't know what story it is, and it might not even have been included in the omnibus editions because there is a gap. But they tell a story about how they were just out taking a trip and came across Professor Clyde, who had just invented a time machine. "My time machine, a powerful Z-ray, will send it across the time barrier into the future. I wish I had someone to try it out." And they said, "We'll try it out. That seems likely." So they travel through to the future because I guess Superboy had already planned on moving to Metropolis, so they wanted to see how he turned out. So it says one more thing. The professor warned that the time machine will whisk us back into the past at midnight. We can only stay till then. Kind of like Cinderella. So he decides to just show them around, shows them the Fortress of Solitude, explains to them, "I wrapped you in a blanket because I'm taking you far north to visit my secret place of Fortress of Solitude." The Fortress of Solitude. I think they probably figured out there in the north. Also, his key appears to have shrunk considerably. I don't know if this is just the way Al Plastino draws it, but so he's kind of doing his thing, riding some space creature and tug of war with a bunch of robots. So they're wandering around on their own, and they go into the room of Kara and Jor-El, or Lara and Jor-El. And Pa Kent says, "Let's get out of here, dear. This isn't meant for us." Naturally, he would honor them. So the story keeps going on. And there is a room honoring his parents, who are them. And he says, "I have two sets of parents and love them both dearly. You made a happy home for me during my boyhood as Superboy. I could never thank you enough for having adopted me." So he offers them a trophy, but Pa Kent says, "We can't bring things back through the time barrier. Only themselves, so they can't take it." Clark sees that Lois Lane is there, and so she comes and she meets the parents, and Jonathan Kent says, "Delicious, Lois. Lois would make a fine wife for any man. Clark, why don't you ask her to marry you?" So Clark thinks Dad's getting across that he approves of Lois Lane being my wife someday, because certainly making a meal is what makes a great wife. That's the 1950s. I mean, the whole thing with Lois just crazy about marrying Superman is it's a bit insulting to Lois Lane, I think. But again, it's a different era. So he spots a circus train that has a car that has come loose and has to bail out. And he says, "Psst, Dad, a job for Superman has come up. I've got to slip out in a hurry. Cover for me." So they are kind of making excuses for why Clark had to leave. Well, it turns out after Lois leaves, they are fakes. They are an actor and actress who have dressed as Martha and Jonathan Kent to trick him. Now, that is absurd because apparently they did some research and figured out that Martha and Jonathan were the most likely to be the parents of Superboy. So they just took a guess, and they were right. Now, how in the world there's so many problems with that. Particularly, how did they duplicate their voices? But that's kind of the way it was back then. If you kind of look like the person, and you would think Superman with his supervision, and I know that they say he didn't use his X-ray vision. Well, there's a whole lot of other things he could have used to figure out that they were fakes. But they want him to get kryptonite, so they're going to trick him into, because they say that if they have some kryptonite, they can bring it back, and the scientists can come up with a cure. So, magnificent, son. Just like the super deeds you did as Superboy. I love the fact that they always refer to Superboy in as a separate person, and not just say Clark. They use his super name, so it's quite silly. And he's continuing to show them more things, his robots, but they convince him to go get kryptonite so that they could bring it back in time and create an antidote. So Superman is really dim-witted in this particular story. But he manages to make a little tiny submersible. This has got to be the dumbest thing, but it's hilariously stupid. So he brings them back the kryptonite, and they say, all right, it's midnight, so we got to go. And as Carson works a secret device in a plastic bubble, that spreads steam around the bubble as if it's vanishing in the midst of time. Goodbye, Mom and Dad. I'll never forget your visit. Choke. Actually, we're just rolling out of sight among bushes when we could slip away when Superman leaves. It's gone across the time barrier. No, it's right there. I can only imagine the sound of cracking, snapping branches and rustling leaves, and somehow he doesn't notice any of it. All of a sudden it occurs to him, wait a second, they said they can't bring anything back. So how did they bring the kryptonite back? And he looks outside, and the time machine's just sitting there. He's like, oh, I was fooled. So now this is actually, this is the second story in a row where normal humans have used Superman to their own ends. And it seems like Superman is maybe the last being you would want to toy with. But actually their plan is kind of impressive. It's ridiculous, but now that they know Superman's secret, they're blackmailing him. And with Superman, he can get you all the money that you could ever want. So they order him to get gold, jewels, platinum, $5 million. And they're going to continue doing that as long as they can. So he brings them back, and they want it in a giant gift. And they tell him, float it down. So they get all the stuff, and they're all happy. So she goes out, and he says, you take half the kryptonite so that Superman can't do anything. It just seems like eventually he's going to get them. But what he does is he creates several robots. And Jonathan is there by himself, the actor. The robot comes and uses hypnotic eye beams to cause him to forget. This really seems like a cheat. Superman is already godlike, and he can also create hypnotic robots too. This is... So then she says, you will forget all about having visited Clark Kent and finding out he's Superman. You will forget. So he does. And then a robot Jonathan Kent does the same thing with Martha. And he says he had the robots take the kryptonite away. And so they are flummoxed. They don't know, what were we disguised like this for, Millicent? What happened yesterday? My mind is blank. So they get away with it. They don't get the money, but they don't go to jail. Thanks to my super hypnosis, they'll never remember having visited Clark. as Mom and Dad Kent. My secret identity is safe. Phew. So he says, regardless of how it turned out, I'll just pretend Mom and Dad did visit me from the past. Bless them. No, they really didn't. And in fact, I would think it would be a bitter memory for him, but I guess Superman just looks on the bright side of things. So that was Superman's Lost Parents. The Return of Superman's Lost Parents. From Action Comics 247.